Today we're taking a look at all of the new rules for Chaos Knights from Engine War, so let's see what sort of dread households are going to be stomping around the battlefield in weeks to come. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. It's time for the third of the 4 faction reviews in Engine War today, and we're looking at the Chaos Knights. I was interested to see what the Chaos and Imperial Knights will be getting out of this book, as they already have a very decent amount of options in their codex already. The answer for Chaos Knights is rather simple, but still rather good from a power perspective. They're essentially acquiring dread households and absolutely nothing else. I know it's a fairly simple buff, but it basically means you get a flat bonus to your knights to make them stronger on top of all the things that you already had. So it's pretty good because there's absolutely no opportunity cost. Your knights are just going to be getting better in one way or another, and that's the end of it. So let's have a talk about how these dread households are going to be working. So they laid out in a section of the book exactly how the rules are going to work. Every Chaos Knight gains the dread household keyword, which you swap out for exactly which household you decide to choose. You don't lose the Iconoclast or Infernal benefits at all, they just plain get extra rules on top of these 2 very juicy bonuses that they already have. I will say though that unlike the Imperial Knights, the main strength of the Chaos Knights does seem to be in these 2 traits. The household traits are a little bit weaker than the Imperial ones, but then from what they previewed it looks like the Imperial Knights' more generic traits for Mechanicum and Questoris are going to be a little weaker than these Iconoclast or Infernal bonuses. Basically any knight can acquire a dread household trait, but only those in super heavy detachments actually get the household bond, the same as the chapter tactic. But as far as I can tell, you can nominate one in an auxiliary support detachment. That can still gain the keyword, but it won't gain a household bond. Sorry for the random Y that's in the word super there, by the way. When you're choosing a dread household, you have the choice of one of the 5 households of infamy, which are Lucaris, Herpetrax and Chimere for the Iconoclast households, and Vextrix or Commentis for the Infernal households. Just rules-wise, if you are using one in a super heavy auxiliary detachment, then it's best to make it one of these households of renown, as at least this way you gain access to extra stratagems, warlord traits and relics, which even if you weren't fussed about the warlord traits or relics, then you may as well just have access to one extra stratagem and just choose which one you're most likely to use for it. The other option is to make a custom dread household. Gains a household bond. You can either pick one major one or 2 minor ones and clump them together in the usual way. Obviously these don't get any of the above benefits such as warlord traits, stratagems or artifacts. Let's start by talking about the dread households of renown then, and we'll go for the Iconoclast ones first. Just to clarify for those who aren't aware, Iconoclast is the one that gives you +1 attack in the first round of combat and +1 to the AP of the weapons, and also makes 1 additional model flee if a morale test is failed within 12 inches. So best for up close fighty knights more than anything else. They can take various vows which improve them at the start of the battle in some way, such as rerolling wound rolls of 1 against vehicles and monsters, and have access to a relic that gives them a 4+ invul save. As we mentioned, the 3 Iconoclast households of renown are Herpetrax, Lucaris and Chimere. Herpetrax has the Dauntless bond, which is +2 wounds to the big knights, or +1 wound for the war dogs. Interestingly enough, this trait is also available on the custom dread household houses, where its only real purpose would be if you wanted to give it to an Infernal household, so if you're Infernal and you desperately want this trait, then you can still do it. It's pretty plain and simple really, just a little bit of extra durability to your knights, amounting to around about an 8 or 9% durability buff. It's not a lot, but it's not nothing either. Your knights will just stay alive for that little bit longer. Their warlord trait is bound to none, and this one is actually a really solid one. When the model is destroyed, you roll a dice and on a 4+, you get back up with D3 wounds remaining. If you explode however, then you just go down in flames anyway, and this doesn't apply. This is like the Imperial Tyrannus stratagem or the Infernal stratagem that you just get for the cost of a warlord trait, and could be a good one if you're throwing your knight to the wolves and just charging him straight up the board. I think that this is one of the better warlord traits in the book if I'm honest. The artifact is the Crown of Jedathra. This is a melee -1 to hit modifier, so makes him decently more durable but only against melee. Maybe a reasonable buy-in if your opponent's army only does damage in melee and doesn't have all that much guns, so situationally quite powerful, a good relic to take with the stratagem as a countermeasure. Finally, for the stratagem they have a 1 command point warping aura, which frankly I'm really not that big a fan of. Basically you roll a dice for each unit within 1 inch of this model, and on the roll of a 4+, each unit takes 1 mortal wound. This happens at the end of the fight phase by the way, which isn't the most helpful timing either, seeing as you might just have killed anything that you were in combat in the first place. And if you haven't, then you're basically guaranteed that anything that you're in combat with at least gets to strike you back. Frankly, I'm really not a big fan of this stratagem, it's really underwhelming indeed. You'd have to be in combat with absolutely loads of things for it to be anywhere near worth it. So decent trait, decent warlord trait, and reasonable artifacts against melee, but the stratagem's a bit rubbish. House Lucaris has the bond of virtue through strength, which is +1 to the hit rolls on the first round of close combat. The first round of close combat being anything but consolidating into the enemy if you were charged, made a charge, or made a heroic intervention. This twins absolutely excellently with the Iconoclast trait. It's a bit useless if you're already hitting on 2s already, but it's exactly the sort of thing that I'd like to see on something like a dual thermal cannon Chaos Knight, or maybe just one of the more standard patterns with the gun and a Reaper Chainsword or Thunderstrike Gauntlet. It really is doubling down on the melee prowess of Iconoclast households. Hopefully this buff also applies to Titanic Feet, which is really good as quite a lot of the buffs in this book are unfortunately restricted from that. This one will provide basically a 25% buff to melee that's already buffed through the sky due to the awesome Iconoclast trait. For example, if you had a dual thermal cannon knight charging into a bunch of Primaris Space Marines, a completely unbuffed knight would get an average of about 4 or 5 wounds through. When it's attacking with its Titanic Feet, a standard Iconoclast knight would get around about 7 wounds through, which is already massive. As an Iconoclast knight would get a mighty 8.5 wounds through, due to the multiple stacking buffs that it receives. You've got it to the point where you're almost double the melee capacity with Titanic Feet, so this really isn't a bad bond to go for if you just want to cause some close combat carnage. Their warlord trait was previewed, and unfortunately it's not very strong, it's just literally fighting first in the fight phase, and this shouldn't usually be a problem for Chaos Knights at all, as they can happily fall back, shoot and then charge again, so they should be getting the first strike anyway due to being able to repeatedly charge. I'd most definitely leave this one at home pretty much in any circumstance. Their artifact is Serpent Strike. Weirdly enough, this is a relic 2 twin melter guns for one of the Dominus pattern or Knight Tyrant Knights. Basically it buffs those melter guns to be strength 9, and the melter rule of rolling 2d6 and always picking the highest always applies, even when they're at 12 inches. Now the twin melter guns are a bit of an underrated weapon for this knight, they really are basically another primary weapon, but honestly I'm not all that enthused by this buff enough to give it as a relic, compared with something better. The strength 8 to strength 9 bracket change is only going to matter against toughness 8. It's not bad, but it's not guaranteed to be the target that you're firing at, and the melter rule going from 3.5 average damage to 4.5 is about a 20-something% damage buff. It's not awful, but it's not changed the world against vehicles. It might only make the difference of about 1 more wound on them than you otherwise would have got. Again, I think there's better relics to be had than this one, and Knight Tyrants aren't really the strongest at the moment in any case. Finally, their stratagem is a little mortal wound generating one. It's 1 command point called Trample Them. Basically, if you fall them back across an enemy unit and you move across them, roll a dice, and on a 2 to 5 they take d3 mortal wounds, and on a 6 they take d6 mortal wounds. A bit niche in where it can apply, unfortunately. You're only going to be falling back across infantry and swarms in the first place, and frankly 1 command point for an average of around about 2 mortal wounds isn't the most inspiring either. So sorry to be a little bit down on House Lucaris. I think that the bond actually is really quite powerful, and it synergizes amazingly with the Iconoclast army, but unfortunately I think that's the only real thing that I'd take Lucaris for. I don't think any of the rest are really worth the opportunity cost of giving up other better warlord traits, artifacts and stratagems. Finally we come to House Chimere. Their bond is Rampant Cruelty, where a melee weapon that isn't Titanic Feet rerolls wound rolls of 1. Now pretty much all the time this is going to be weaker than House Lucaris, particularly when you're fighting with Titanic Feet, which is one of the ways that we're almost always going to be fighting with Chaos Knights, as they're just so good. The only real place that I think that this is particularly inspiring is if you're fighting with a Knight Rampager, so you're hitting on 2s anyway, and you're striking with either the Chainsword or the Gauntlets, so you actually get some sort of benefit to it rather than the Titanic Feet. Frankly, if you're taking a household just for its trait, then Lucaris will almost universally trump this one. I don't think that the first round of combat thing is much of a disadvantage, as we said, you can happily fall back and re-engage with knights. I guess the only major issue might be with war dogs and things, so that could be a mild consideration as well. Their warlord trait is Maddened Cries, which is a 12-inch 2d6 leadership debuff, where the opponent rolls 2d6 for their morale tests and takes the highest of the results. Again, with leadership this is pretty underwhelming. It's going to mean an average of 1 more model fleeing than otherwise would, and a lot of armies are immune, so maybe just a reactive one to buy in if you're fighting a particularly leadership susceptible army. Their relic is Annihilatum, which is a relic conflagration cannon. So for a Knight Tyrant with one of those, this one's Assault d6, so you can advance and fire it. It's got the same strength 7 and AP -2, but it's a flat damage 3, which is always helpful. Basically a nice simple 50% damage buff against heavy targets, and even better than this against 3 wound things, such as Primaris Aggressors. The advancing thing is kind of fun as well. It does mean that you're just that little bit more likely to get it in range of something that you need to. But of course this comes with the downside of not being able to fire your other weapons, so it's a bit of a trade-off as opposed to a flat buff to shooting. Not bad, it's a perfectly reasonable pickup if you are taking a Knight Tyrant with a conflagration cannon, but it is a bit of a shame that it has absolutely no synergy with its bond whatsoever, as of course they don't have any melee weapons apart from Titanic feet. I guess it'd make the most sense for a Knight Tyrant with a conflagration cannon that's in a super heavy auxiliary support detachment. Finally, we have the stratagem, which is 2 command points for Fury of Surtur's Wake. This one's a 3-inch aura of D3 mortal wounds and 4+ for each unit nearby. Now this one does sound quite similar to House Herpetrax, but I do think it's a fair bit better. The main reason being that House Herpetrax only affects things that are within 1 inch of it, whereas this one can apply to things that you aren't in close combat with. It's also a lot more helpful with the timing as well, as it happens any time in the shooting phase, meaning that it'll be just after you've moved your knight, so you can position it optimally to affect the most units with this. 2 command points does mean it has a bit of a higher opportunity cost than some, but if you did manage to get something like 5 or 6 units in range of a knight, which certainly isn't impossible, then you could average about 6 mortal wounds for that investment, which really isn't too bad to my mind. A little situational, you have to be bold with your knight, but could be worth it. So for this one, the trait is okay, probably better on war dogs than main knights due to the Titanic feet restriction. The warlord trait is pretty much garbage, the artifact's okay on Knight Tyrants, and the stratagem's a nice one to have, but not necessarily something to plan around. For me, out of the Iconoclast ones, my favourite would be Herpetrax or Lucaris, as I just think that the bond for those households is so much better, with my absolute favourite being Lucaris, although it does have the downside of the rest of the options for it being pretty much rubbish. I just like the sheer raw amount of melee damage that a bunch of Lucaris Iconoclasts could put out. Let's move on to some Infernal households now then, and the 2 that we have are Vextrix and Commentis. For those who aren't aware, the Infernal households are essentially the dark mirror of the Questor Mechanicum, and their ability is to be able to lose a mortal wound for any one of D3 random buffs, which are Demonic Hunger, which is +2 to the model's move and +1 to advance and charge, Demonic Fortitude, adding 1 to their toughness, or Demonic Power, adding 1 to their one weapon's strength and damage characteristics. Alternatively, they can take D3 mortal wounds and choose the one of these they want the most. The one that I seem to see used the most for these guys is the Demonic Power one, where it's great for amping up something like an Avenger Gatling Cannon, as turning this from a 12-shot Strength 6 Damage 2 weapon into a 12-shot Strength 7 Damage 3 weapon is a massive upgrade and could be well worth a couple of mortal wounds on your knight. They have a couple of powerful stratagems, including one to heal when they kill enemy models in close combat for 2 CP, and a 3 command point one to potentially get them back up at the end of a turn, in a similar way to House Tyrannus for Imperial Knights. House Vextrix is the first of the households then, and its bond is Titankin, where you reroll a single hit and wound roll for each knight every time it either shoots, makes an Overwatch attacks, or attacks in the fight phase. So it's Salamander style rerolls, but on a knightly scale. In general, these sort of rerolls do tend to be strongest if you're using them on something like multiple small units, which knights are pretty much the opposite of. I really wouldn't discount it though, because particularly when you're using something like a Reaper Chainsword, if you get to reroll a failed hit and wound, then that could translate to an enormous amount of increased damage. Say if we were attacking with a standard knight that's hitting on 3s with a Reaper Chainsword, it actually winds up being a pretty enormous buff with approximately a 35% to 40% damage buff. That means if you were dueling an enemy Chaos Knight, an unbuffed knight with a Reaper Chainsword would on average do a mean of 9 wounds to that knight, where a House Vextrix knight would do an average of 12, which is pretty meaningful, never mind the powerful bonus that it also gets in the shooting phase, say if it's got a thermal cannon or something in addition. Just like with Master Artisans and Space Marines, this one is really very strong indeed, and in terms of raw damage power, this is one of the strongest traits that you can take on the Chaos Knights in this book, I think. I think a lot of people might dismiss this because it's only 2 rerolls per knight, but that happens every time you shoot and every time you fight, and the weapons that you tend to be rerolling tend to have very good damage characteristics, whether that's thermal cannons or Reaper Chainswords with damage 6, or maybe even buffed up Avenger Gatling Cannons with the Infernal bonus, which have a flat damage of 3. I suspect it might be even better for War Dogs as well, particularly the Armature Warglaive version of War Dogs with the thermal cannons and Reaper Chain Cleavers, where this is just going to make them far more threatening both at shooting and in melee. I honestly think that this will get adopted as one of the more common ones with Chaos Knights going forward. Their warlord trait's a bit underwhelming though, I'm afraid. It's Favour of the Dark Mechanicum, basically regenerating 1 wound per turn. It's not bad, it might get a few extra wounds over the course of the battle, but it's not doing anything until your opponent has started to chip damage away from that knight, and it won't do anything if they actually destroy the knight, so you're kind of banking at multiple turns on half health, which isn't unreasonable, but it also might not happen over the course of an entire game. I think it's just a bit too minor for me, I'd probably leave this at home for something else. Their artifact is the Heretic Power Core. This one we saw previewed. It's +1 move, +1 damage to a Reaper's Chainsword or Thunderstrike Gauntlet, and +1 to the chance of exploding. They're 3 minor buffs, to be honest. I think the +1 damage to the Reaper or the Thunderstrike is rarely going to be meaningful. It's rarely going to be the difference between whether you kill something or whether you don't. Chaos Knights in close combat will generally just wreck whatever they've reached, and they'll often just be wanting to attack with their Titanic feet anyway. The explodes thing is interesting, but also has the potential to work against you as well. If this thing does go up in the middle of your lines, then you could lose the game then and there. If you have this relic and the knight looks like it might go down, then I'll probably want to save a command point reroll for this explosion, to give it more of a chance of going up if it's in enemy lines, or give it less of a chance of blowing up if it's in your own. Again, not enormously convinced by this relic. I'm afraid I prefer to take something from the main codex. Finally, they have a slightly costly stratagem, which is Interception Array, which basically allows a knight to ignore any modifiers in the shooting phase. Now this is good, but I would have preferred it a lot more if it had just costed 1 command point. At 2 CP, you're really paying a premium for it, so I'm not sure it's going to be worth it unless it's something like -2 modifiers, and it certainly won't be worth it unless you're using a knight with some really big guns. Best case scenario, something like a Dominus Knight shooting against Eldar flyers could well be worth it in that sort of case, or maybe a knight that's been heavily bracketed trying to shoot at something that's -1 to hit. Either way, this is going to become less of an issue when 9th edition comes out and stacking modifiers aren't a thing anymore. So overall, absolutely love the trait. This could be great for dual thermal cannon knights, anything with a Reaper Chainsword or Thunderstrike gauntlets, but possibly most powerful with masked war dogs, charging forward with thermal spears and Reaper chain cleavers. Next we have House Commentis, whose bond is Profane Symbiosis. This one actually combines 2 of the benefits that you can get from the custom households, which is when you're less than half wounds you get +1 attack and +1 to hit rolls in melee, keeping your knights more active in the fight phase even as they get bracketed. They also have a built-in 5+ Feel No Pain against any damage that's caused in the psychic phase. Honestly, I find this one a bit underwhelming. Again, you're banking on knights being injured but not killed, and it only helps them out in the melee phase, not in the shooting phase. The psycho protection again isn't bad, but only relevant in certain matchups. I'm afraid I'm not the biggest fan of this trait as it is. The Warlord trait is actually quite interesting though, as it basically allows you to open up with a ridiculous amount of firepower once per game. It's called Dead Hunter, it's once per game, and it buffs one of your guns when you're firing with it in the shooting phase. That gun gets +1 damage, and you get to reroll hit rolls and wound rolls when you're firing the gun. Basically, I think this was kind of made to be used on the gun that's using the Infernal bonus to buff one gun, so you can have multiple stacking damage on the same amount of shots. It's generally best on something that has a huge amount of rate of fire. The Avenger Gatling Cannon is the most obvious choice that springs to mind. Between this buff and taking D3 mortal wounds on your knight for the Infernal trait, you'll have an Avenger Gatling Cannon that's Strength 7, AP -3, Damage 4, and will reroll all rolls to hit and wound. The damage that thing can do is absolutely apocalyptic. Against a standard Toughness 8 vehicle without an invul save, that's an average of 20 wounds. If you're firing it against a Toughness 7 vehicle, it's more like 27, so you're likely massively overkilling whatever you're firing at. If you point it at a super heavy, like an enemy knight with a 4+ invul, it is a bit worse. It's more like 12 wounds on average on that knight, but that's still a very significant amount of dead knight for 1 round shooting. I think it can get even sillier than this though. You could put it on a Knight Castigator, who's essentially got an Avenger Gatling Cannon that's heavy 16 rather than heavy 12, and if you fire his thing at a 4+ invul save Imperial Knight, then that'll be an average of 16 wounds on the thing. If you weren't wanting to massively overkill a vehicle though, you could potentially have a dual Avenger Gatling Cannon Knight, or a dual Battle Cannon Knight, use the Infernal bonus on one, and use this Warlord trait bonus on the other, so you've got 2 ridiculously hard-hitting Alpha Strikey type guns. If it were me, I'd be wanting to use this as early as possible in the game, to make sure that I had used it before the knight was destroyed, and to get enemy models dead earlier, so they can't destroy knights later in the game. I think this one's really quite a good Warlord trait, could certainly be worth buying in with the stratagem. Their artifact is the Daemonic Shrike, which is another pretty solid buff to shooting weapons, although it is slightly close ranged. Basically at the start of your shooting phase, you nominate an enemy unit within 18 inches, and all of your weapons have an additional -1 AP against that unit. Now this is actually a really meaningful bonus, as it applies not only in the shooting phase, but also in the fight phase as well. So it'd be good for using things like your Titanic feet or Avenger Gatling cannons or things. It's going to have the most effect with the lower AP weapons that you're using, so that's why those sort of low AP weapons are the best things to go for. Say if you've got a dual Avenger Knight advancing up towards the enemy, and you have something like a Repulsor Executioner within 18 inches, on average your dual Avenger cannons would get an average of 7 wounds against the thing. That'd go up to 9 with the extra AP bonus, so an extra 25% damage output if you're shooting at something with a power armor save of 3+, and it gets even better if you're targeting 2+ saves. Then if you came to charge the same unit, you could use the bonus on the Titanic feet as well. Going from AP -2 to AP -3 is again a 25% damage boost. This could also make things like heavy flamers on the Avenger cannons extra nasty, plus any other small arms that you had. I think this is actually really quite a potent little relic, provided you're happy to have your knight focus down one unit each turn. I think about maybe buying this in reactively, against the armies where the extra AP is going to matter a fair bit, things like Space Marines for example. Finally, their one command point stratagem is Encircling Hounds, and it allows you to outflank a War Dog unit arriving within 6 inches of the table edge and greater than 9 inches away from the enemy, anytime turn 2 or turn 3. Certainly helpful, could allow you to come at the opponent from an unusual angle, although I'll be honest, I'm not sure how much I'd be tempted to use this myself. In more competitive games it's really quite easy to screen out large sections of the flanks, particularly if you're playing an army that has decent board control. In general with War Dogs I'd be more tempted just to start them on the table for the most part. Overall, House Commentis has a sort of slightly underwhelming trait in my eyes, but a pretty impressive Warlord trait and artifact, so it kind of depends if you're willing to give up a slightly worse trait to unlock those powerful options. I think they've done a reasonable job of making it a slightly tricky choice for us. The ones that I feel have the better traits tend to not have quite as good stuff in the other options, meaning that you could genuinely go down some different routes with building your Chaos Knight army. Finally, we come to our list of custom Dread households. If none of the others have tickled your fancy, then maybe one of these will. Basically, there's really quite a big list of different Dread household benefits. You can either pick one of the supposedly slightly more powerful ones, or two of the supposedly slightly weaker ones from the list below. Naturally, you give up the options of getting the Stratagem, Relic and Warlord trait from these, but I think that some of them really are quite interesting, and they definitely allow you to go down different routes with your household. For the more powerful ones then, we first have Endless Torment. This one allows you to reroll a single dice for the number of attacks when you're making shooting attacks. It's going to be most powerful on something like a Thermal Cannon Knight, if you do happen to roll something like a 1 or a 2. I think that this has most impact on something like a Dual Thermal Cannon Knight, as you're rolling 2 very big d6 rolls, so you've got a pretty reasonable chance of one of them rolling low. If you re-rolled 1s and 2s with a Thermal Cannon Knight, then that typically is going to equate to, on average, a 16% increase in the amount of shots that you get. It's pretty similar in terms of averages to if the knight had re-roll 1s to hit or to wound, for example. I think to make it worth it, you pretty much would have to have every knight in the army have either 1 or 2 thermal cannons, or maybe another weapon with a powerful random number of shots, perhaps conflagration cannons, or the volcano lance of the tyrant knights. Certainly a pretty reasonable one if you're going Iconoclast, but if you are going Infernal, but I do think it's going to be pretty much worse than a House Vextrix Knight in pretty much every situation. If you are going Infernal, however, even on a dual thermal cannon knight, which is about the best that this household could hope for, the Vextrix Knight will generally increase the damage output by more like 20%, so it is a decent amount better. Still, not an unreasonable choice if you're running a trio of Iconoclast with thermal cannons. Next we have Geists of Ruin, which is a durability buff. Basically, if you're greater than 24 inches away from the enemy that's shooting you, you count as being in cover, typically for a 2+ save. This one's very nice indeed, to be honest, particularly for knights that are going to be engaging at range a bit more than in close combat. It's not going to be very meaningful against the highest AP weapons, things with AP 3 or AP 4, as that'll put you down to your Iron Shield anyway. This one's just going to help out with long-range weapons that are AP -2 or worse. I'm a little bit on the fence about this one. In some games I think that will matter, but unless you know that your knights are pretty much definitely going to hang back and therefore sacrifice all their melee potential, then it's not generally going to be the most worth it. I think it could be fairly good for the Helverin pattern War Dogs though, as they're pretty much happy to stay as far away as possible, and might be threatened by things like autocannons with AP -1, but this will help out against quite a lot. Next we have Warp Vision, which is basically ignores cover for your knight. Again, solid trait. This will be helpful in most games. Going to be most useful on anything without a particularly high AP. Say if you're using a lot of the Helverin pattern War Dogs, they only have AP -1, or maybe wielding a few knights with dual Gatling cannons. If you're seeing a lot of Space Marines in the meta, then this could be a particularly good one for combating them, whether they're lurking in cover with their power armor or using the stealthy trait. If your main strategy is combat or thermal cannons though, then this one's probably one to pass up. Next we have Enlightened Idolators. Basically you just ignore AP -1 on your knights, so things like autocannons will have a slightly harder day getting through your armor. Frankly, the vast majority of AP -1 stuff is strength 7 or lower, and isn't particularly efficient on knights. Could help out against some heavy bolters and things I suppose if you're facing mass ones and Space Marines, but this one's just too swingy and matchup dependent for me. I would avoid this trait. Next we have Hellforged Construction, which is essentially the Herpetrax Iconoclast trait, but made as a general one so you can take it as Infernal. That's the only reason to take it over Herpetrax in a competitive type setting, as if you are playing Iconoclast, then you may as well at least have access to the stratagem that Herpetrax provides, as well as the Warlord trait and artifact should you want them. Again, small but meaningful durability buff, +2 wounds to big knights, +1 wound to war dogs. This one will be useful, but it isn't the biggest buff. Next up we have Vengeful Outcasts, which is reroll wound rolls of 1 versus Imperium, both in the shooting and the fight phase. So flat 17% damage buff against all of these guys, unless you already had a reroll to wound or something. Now this honestly depends on the meta. If you're seeing nothing but Imperial armies, then it's going to be very usable. Decent damage output increase across your entire army is nothing to sneeze at. Or of course, if you are knowing that you're fighting Imperium in a given game, then it could be a good one to nominate, although that could be construed as list tailoring a bit, so it might not be the best idea there either. In general, buffs like this aren't considered the strongest, because they have some impact in some games, but nothing at all in other games, where really you just want a reliable power boost against all armies, rather than just a random selection of them. Next we have Heretical System Bond, which is basically an anti-modifier trait for your entire army. They get +1 to their hit roll if you're suffering any negative to hit roll modifiers. So this one's definitely your friend against things like Alatok Eldar, Styges Adeptus Mechanicus, or any army with flyers for example. It's good, but it very much suffers from the same problem as the last one. It's going to be very useful against some armies, and then absolutely no use whatsoever against others. So unless literally the entire meta is going to be taking -1 to hits, then it's not necessarily worth picking up. For me, for these single traits, my favourite ones are Endless Torment, if you're taking Iconoclast thermal cannons, and Warp Vision to ignore cover, if you've got a lot of Avenger Gatling cannons, or other slightly lower AP guns. The second half of the list, you can pick 2 of these traits, mixing and matching whatever you desire. First up we have Pinpoint Cruelty, which allows you to reroll a single damage result each time you make a shooting attack, melee attack, or fire overwatch. Basically this is very similar to the Endless Torment one, in terms of the amount of extra damage that you receive, provided you're attacking with a knight that's got damage d6 weapons, though this is a little bit more redundant if you do already have the rerolls from being within melter range, say for a thermal cannon within 18 inches, but it's still a nice to have. This could be particularly potent on an army with a large number of war dogs, if you equip them with those thermal spears. Basically the more knights you have, the more rerolls that you have, so the higher chance of getting extra damage with this trait. I think this is a good one, provided you've got a d6 damage weapon on your knight, this is a reasonable pickup. Next we have Infamous Heredity, and each time they shoot, fight or fire overwatch, then they get to reroll 1 single hit roll. Now this one's really solid on any knight with a slightly lower number of shots, or at least something that's firing a very heavy powerful weapon, such as a thermal cannon or a volcano lance for example. Again this will be an absolutely excellent one on a large amount of war dogs with melter weapons, particularly combined with the other Pinpoint Cruelty one, as that's going to add up to a lot of rerolls if you have a lot of their thermal spears. This is a very solid one to be picked up as half of a trait. Next up we have Slayer of Kings, which is +1 to the hit rolls in melee versus vehicles and monsters. It's not bad, but I'm not necessarily quite as much of a fan of this one, as it only helps you out against certain targets. Vehicles and monsters are abundant in 40k, but they're not present in every army, and seeing as it's only in melee, you might not always be able to reach the enemy's vehicles in melee, say if they're Imperial Guard, and their Leman Russes are hidden safe behind 150 screening infantry. Not bad, particularly not bad against things like enemy knights, but also not one of my favourite on this list. Next we have Dark Forging, which is +6 inch range to 24 inch range or more weapons, and +2 inch range to other closer range ones, such as Heavy Flamers or Wardog Moirax Rad Cleansers. This one's okay, basically it's going to provide the biggest buff to any threatening 24 inch range weapons that they have, and the vast majority of Imperial Knight weapons tend to be 36 inch range. I think the extra range is meaningful, and it will sometimes give you the choice of your optimal targets rather than one that's a bit closer and in range. And if you are running things like Avenger Gatlings or thermal cannons, then I think this will add up to better choices over the course of the game, or even just being able to outrange the enemy a bit. If you are in a gunfight, it's not bad, and if you are using the 36 inch range guns, then perfectly reasonable as a half of a trait. Next we have Pride Fueled Fury. This affects knights that are less than half wounds left, and it gives them +1 attack and +1 to hit rolls in melee. So it's basically the better half of the House Commentis benefits. Honestly I think it's pretty nice to have, and it's good as your knights get bracketed. If you are going for a mainly melee centered strategy, then this one could be worth a pickup. Next we have one that was unfortunately off the screen when I was trying to read the leaks that I got this from, so I'm afraid I don't know the name, and I also don't know whether it belongs in this list or the one at the top where you can only pick one of them. I suspect it's one of the ones that you can pick 2 of, as I don't think it's all that strong, but honestly who knows with Games Workshop when it comes to balance. This one gives you +1 movement, and furthermore as you get degraded, you can always use the top bracket when it comes to movement. Again, a small quality of lifestyle upgrade, +1 movement will add up over the course of a game, though it's not going to be the sort of turn that every turn it's going to make the difference whether you're making charges or not. The non-degrading movement is also nice to have. Again, I'd most consider it if I was going forward with the knights, trying to get them into melee. Generally on bigger Titanic type knights, I would be thinking about falling back and re-engaging optimal targets with. Could be a nice one to combo with Pride Fueled Fury, where you're going to have knights that are operating on very good capacity all the way until they're dead. Next we have Harrying Pact, which is a War Dog one. This allows War Dogs to either shoot or charge after they fell back, though sadly not both. If you are going down a big War Dog strategy, then this one's definitely a helpful one to have. It could particularly help ones with autocannons fall back and still fire, as locking up can be a problem for them, but hopefully that will be going away in 9th edition, so it won't be as relevant. Fall back and charge could be handy for the ones with the chain cleavers, allowing them to better optimally engage enemy units, rather than getting bogged down and fighting a tar pit or something. Definitely adds a lot of flexibility, you just have to weigh that up against a more damage dealing type trait. Next we have Frenzied Attackers, which is a nice bonus to melee weapons, but sadly not the Titanic Feet of Imperial Knights. Frankly that's a real shame, because the Titanic Feet are one of the best close combat weapons that Imperial Knights have. Doubly so in Iconoclast, where they get +1 to the AP of the things. If you're hitting on 3s, then this is a 25% increase to close combat, and if you're hitting on 2s, such as a Knight Rampager, it's going to be a 20% boost, so a little bit less useful on them. I feel like I'm saying this a lot, but again this could be great on War Dogs with chain cleavers. They have no temptation to use Titanic Feet as they don't have any, they only have little feet and are happy to use their chain cleaver instead. This is actually really quite a significant buff to the melee damage output of these things, particularly when combined with Iconoclast, and maybe even the reroll to hit trait from Infamous Heredity. A standard War Dog when attacking a toughness 7 vehicle will do an average of 4 or 5 wounds to the thing, though obviously in a multiple of 3, whereas an Iconoclast War Dog with the benefit of a single hit reroll and the exploding hits on 6s is just ridiculously stacked with the amount of buffs he gets. He will do an average of 10 wounds to the same toughness 7 vehicle, so via Iconoclast plus these traits, you've actually doubled the expected damage output that you might get from a standard War Dog that didn't have combat bonuses. On paper these things honestly look really threatening indeed. Who knows, maybe this book might make mass War Dogs a bit more of a thing in the competitive scene. Another option for buffing Knight's combat is Hate-Driven Charge. This is a buff that applies only in the first round of combat, so if you charged, were charged, or made a heroic intervention. Basically your weapons, excluding Titanic Feet, get improved AP by -1 until the end of the turn. Now this one's okay, but I don't think it's quite as meaningful as a lot of the rest of them. Besides Titanic Feet, pretty much most weapons in Imperial Knight households have AP -3, so going from AP -3 to AP -4 isn't often that much of a big deal. It'll only ever do anything if you're fighting an army with a 3+ save and no invul save in close combat. It does help for things like Space Marines or enemy vehicles or knights, but it's only a 17% buff to damage, so isn't quite as strong as some of the other things. Typically, I think your reroll hit roll option is going to get you more damage output than this, and of course that also applies in the shooting phase as well, so I'd pretty much universally go for that one over this one. And if you are looking to improve close combat, then Frenzied Attackers is flatly better than this in pretty much every scenario. It just gives a 25% buff, which is better than this one. Next we have the slightly hilariously named Loathing for the Masses, which gives the knight +1 to his hit rolls when he's less than 1 inches from units that are 11 or more in size, so melee only basically, and only really all that useful on knights with a 3+ weapon skill or worse. I'm glad that they let the knights use Trampling Feet on this one. Honestly, this is a very niche target. Unless you absolutely know that you're fighting hordes, then it's not worth taking, to be honest. I'd take one of the other buffs that reliably does damage to everything, not just big units. Next we have Bold Tyrants, which is another really quite solid if slightly inflexible shooting buff. Basically when you're resolving an attack with a ranged weapon against a unit that's less than 12 inches away, you add 1 to the AP of it, similar to that Shrike relic that we talked about earlier. This could be pretty handy on things like Avenger Gatling cannons or heavy flamers that are stock to Avenger Gatling cannons, and against things with 3+ armor save or better, it'll most certainly have a decent meaningful impact. However, I do think that this is going to be often at odds with what you actually want to shoot with the knight. Things within 12 inches might not be your optimal target, and unless they're perfectly aligned with what you wanted to shoot with those guns, then you are making sacrifices by maybe not shooting a more threatening enemy unit that's further away. I think a lot of the times if you take this, you'll have to make the hard decision of whether or not to shoot an enemy unit that's right next to you and get that damage buff, or shoot an enemy unit that you actually want to shoot a lot more and pass up the damage buff for the turn. Definitely it's a flat buff to things like heavy flamers and things though, who will always be shooting less than 12 inches. Rapid defense is advancing and being able to fire assault weapons without the penalty to moving, pretty much entirely useless on big knights, but I guess could be pretty handy on the armors with the thermal spears once more, getting them a little bit closer to the enemy lines while also being able to lay down their melter firepower at no negative to hit. Probably only worth it if you're taking pretty much nothing but them in a detachment though. And finally we have Unhallowed Inscriptions, which is a 5+ feel no pain type save versus wounds caused in the psychic phase. Again, this is the second part of House Commentis. Against the sort of armies that spam spies, it will actually be really handy, but it's completely useless against the majority of the field, therefore I wouldn't take this in any sort of competitive knight list. So that's the last of the Dread households then. It's interesting that there's absolutely tons of options, but you only really get to select 1 or 2 buffs out of this enormous list. I think they've done a reasonable job at balancing them quite well, but some things certainly stick out quite a lot more than others. For the actual households of infamy, the big ones that get these stratagems and warlord traits, I think actually most of them are really quite usable. Probably the one that I'd rank lowest is House Chimere. For Iconoclast, you have the nice simple extra wounds of Herpetrax, or the lovely extra bonus to hits from Lucaris to make some very hard-hitting knights. And for Infernal, Vextrix is a very decent damage buff even on big knights, but enormously so on things like war dogs with thermal spears, though the other bits of their household aren't so inspiring. And Commentis doesn't have the world's best household bond in the world, but their warlord trait and bond are pretty powerful. For the custom Dread households, I think that in general picking 2 of the minor traits is probably the way to go. The ones that really stand out are Infamous Heredity for re-rolling a single hit roll, Pinpoint Cruelty to re-roll a damage roll, and I really like the little War Dog combo of getting frenzied attackers for their melee weapons and the ability to re-roll a hit roll for both melee and ranged. If you see any particular combos or interesting things that you think I've missed, please let me know down in the comments below, or if I've made any errors then tell me as well and I'll post a correction. I'm really interested to see where people go with these in the future. It's certainly a solid buff to Chaos Knights, if not an enormous one. If you've enjoyed the review, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for further discussions. And if you've been enjoying all the content recently, then I'd just like to mention the channel's Patreon page, which is what allows me to keep this channel going. Basically making all of these videos does take quite a lot of time, and the Patreon is how I can justify spending all of that time on the channel, as well as helping keep new videos coming. Channel patrons get a fair few benefits, including being able to see new videos early, regular votes on what sort of videos come next, and the occasional prize draw, where I post out some miniatures to one lucky winner. If any of that sounds good, or you'd just like to say thank you for the videos, the link is down in the description below, and a big thank you to my current patrons for helping make this channel possible. In any case, a big thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.